start reading in verse number 15 of Luke chapter 24. Now, we're picking up in a story where a couple of Jesus' followers are walking from Jerusalem to a village called Emmaus, which is about 7 miles away. And Jesus has been resurrected, but they don't know it yet. And so they are in kind of the confusion of wondering what has been the last few years of our life. We've been following this man. He's done extraordinary things, and he's said extraordinary things. But who he ultimately was is still in the balance for us. And Jesus is going to reveal himself to them. Now, it's extraordinary that he didn't do this to the most powerful people in Israel. He didn't show up at the rich person's house. He didn't show up in a place of influence. He decided to show up in the middle of a walk with 2 of his followers who were trying to figure their life out after a great loss. That's where we're picking up in the story. Verse 15, and while they were discussing and arguing, Jesus himself came near and began to walk along with them. But they were prevented from recognizing him. Then he asked them, "What is this dispute that you're having with each other as you're walking?" And they stopped walking and looked discouraged. The one named Cleopas answered him, "Are you the only visitor in Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that have happened here in these days?" "What things?" Jesus asked them. So they said to him, "The things concerning Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, powerful in action and speech before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be sentenced to death. And they crucified him. But we were hoping that he was the one who was about to redeem Israel. Besides all this, it's the 3rd day since these things happened. Moreover, some women from our group astounded us. They arrived early at the tomb, and when they didn't find his body, they came and reported that they'd seen a vision of angels who said he was alive." Skip down to verse 28. They came near the village where they were going, and Jesus gave the impression that he was going farther. But they urged him, "Stay with us, because it's almost evening, and now the day is almost over." So Jesus went in to stay with them. It was as he reclined at the table with them that he took the bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. But immediately he disappeared from their sight. They said to each other, "Weren't our hearts burning within us while he was talking with us on the road and explaining the scriptures to us?" That very hour, they got up and returned to Jerusalem. They walked 7 miles back to Jerusalem. They found the 11, the chief disciples or apostles, and those with them gathered together. They were gathered in fear for their lives. And they said, "The Lord has truly been raised and appeared to Simon." Then they began to describe what had happened on the road, how he was made known to them in the breaking of bread. As they were saying these things, Jesus himself appeared and stood in their midst. Jesus said to them, "Peace be with you." But they were startled and terrified and thought they were seeing a ghost. "Why are you troubled?" Jesus asked them. "And why do doubts arise in your hearts? Look at my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Touch me and see, because a ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you can see I have." Having said this, Jesus showed them his hands and feet. But while they were still amazed and in disbelief, because of their joy, he asked them, "Do you have anything here to eat?" That's my kind of guy. So they gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. Easter's an interesting day in our culture, and it's an interesting day to kind of prepare a sermon, because there are generally people in the room in a lot of different places in their faith, their viewpoint on God. And for some of you in the room, no doubt you have a devoted commitment to your faith, to following Jesus, and maybe you have decades of history. For you, Easter is an incredible day, maybe one of the greatest days for you in the church calendar. Others, maybe you're just excited because it's the longest bank holiday weekend of the year. And hopefully the weather's kind of nice, and Tesco also has a huge amount of chocolate on the aisle as you walk through the door. But for all of us, regardless of our reason being here, it's something that we should consider. I mean, we're here. Why are we in the room together? Some of you chose to dress a little nicer today. Maybe a new pastel color palette came into your wardrobe. Some of you maybe were drugged here by your mom. All of us just had to drink some interesting juice and a little tiny wafer. What is all this about? We have a south-facing bay window in our living room. And out of the bay window, if you look to the left, of course, you can see the east where the sun is rising. And if you look to the right, you see the west where the sun sets. And we have a pretty view of the sunrise and the sunset. But it's interesting, before the sun rises, if you look to the right out that bay window, you're actually looking toward the west. And before the sun actually comes up above the horizon, you start to see the clouds glow. So it's like the clouds are high enough above the ground that they see the sun before you do. And so that maybe they're bright pink, maybe they're deep amber. And I find that many of our sermons at church, many of the sermons that I preach from Sunday to Sunday, are kind of like those clouds. They are the results of the sunrise. We're talking about Christian life. We're talking about prayer. We're talking about how to do relationships well. We're talking about how to look at finances. We're talking maybe even about what should as Christians, as people of faith, how should we think about politics or government? I mean, there's just a huge facets of what we talk about. But today, we're kind of turning to the east. And Christianity is innately beautiful, I believe, as a faith system, as a practicing, believing, and sacrificial community. I also think it's compelling and cohesive as a set of beliefs. But today is Resurrection Sunday. And we're turning to look at the eastern sky, and we're staring straight at the sun as it's coming up above the horizon. It's the source of the way we see everything else. So just like if you or I were trying to stare at the sun in our solar system, some of you are kind of having that experience right now with the sun, with the skylight above us. Be prepared when you look at the resurrection straight on. Be prepared for some squinting, some heat, some reorientation perhaps, maybe even some bowing of our face in the intensity as we seek to actually see the most unavoidable part of our history as humans. Have you ever thought about how strange a church service is? I don't just mean like the more formal ones where like the dude who's doing what I'm doing is wearing like a dress and has a pointy hat. I'm talking about like this one, this church service. Like, I mean, just think about it. Just a few hours ago, this was a high school lunchroom, and a team of people showed up here when most of you were still in bed, and they set up a stage and chairs and sound and TVs and kids' rooms and banners and cafe, and then we start to sing songs. Sing songs about our past, about God, about you, me. Most of the songs were probably a bit too loud. And then some person, often a mustached American who looks to maybe 12 years old, reads from an ancient book and then talks about it for an hour or so. Some people cry, some people take notes, others doze off. But throughout the service, people pray, people shout, people dance. We sometimes, again, drink that interesting juice and those tiny wafers. And all the people are from different backgrounds and ethnicities, socioeconomic worlds, education levels. There are artists and accountants, fashion designers and fast food workers, teachers and engineers, CEOs and social workers, roofers and rappers. Come on. Not only all this, but let's take it a step further. This isn't the only weird gathering of its type. There are over 2 billion Christians in the world, almost a third of the world's population, and many of them are doing the same strange thing today in various forms. And these folks have done and are doing loads of other stuff too. They built hospitals, they've founded universities, they've led charities and aid organizations, they've fought for the marginalized and the poor, they've served the least and the last in society, and more. In light of all this, it's pretty fitting to ask, why? Why are all those people doing that? Why have all those people done that for the past 2,000 years? Why are they doing all these things, whether strange and archaic, wild and outlandish, mundane and simple, or costly and sacrificial? What's behind all of this? It's a good line of questioning. Because we can't ignore what some historians say is the most profound movement in history. Secular historian philosopher Will Durant has called Christianity, quote, the most powerful civilizing force in Western history. Jürgen Habermas, the German philosopher and atheist, says, quote, Christianity and nothing else is the ultimate foundation of liberty, conscience, human rights, and democracy, the benchmarks of Western civilization. So when you're asking what's behind all of this, it's a big question. It's created a lot of change. And we've got to be honest about a few things that this is and a few things that this isn't. For example, the Christian faith is just too widespread to be insanity. It's too costly to be hype. It's too ancient to be trendy, and too vibrant to be tradition. It's too diverse to be superiority. It's too grassroots to be control. It's too voluntary to be oppressive. It's too mysterious to be peer pressure. It's too studious to be a fluke. It's too ridiculed to be a fad. It's too universal to be a white thing, or a black thing, or an English thing, or an American thing, or anyone's thing for that matter. It's too compelling to be outdated. It's too publicized to be brainwashing. It's too individual to be coercion. It's too fruitful to be a myth. It's too historical to be metaphorical, and too ubiquitous to be exclusive. It's too complete to be unfounded, yet too unfolding to be finished. It's too personal to be an institution, and too communal to be an anomaly. So what is Christianity? Everything we're on about today. All we do in church, every cloud we look at in the opposite horizon, filled with light and life, it all centers around this day, roughly 1,995 years ago, when a man called Yeshua rose from the dead. And everything Christians have done and are doing and will do for the rest of human history is because of this day. Something happened. And because of that something, something else is happening, and something will happen in the future. And that something happened because people saw something, they witnessed something they couldn't unsee. Have you ever seen something you couldn't unsee? I think about the first time I realized a Greg's sausage roll looks like it's been laminated. Anybody know what I'm talking about? It looks waterproof. It's shiny. Come on, you know what I'm talking about. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Or the time when I noticed my barista who made my takeaway coffee and then grabbed the lid and put the lid on the cup and then to make sure the lid was on, pressed their finger all the way around. And then they handed me my cup and I was like, I appreciate your care that this does not burn me, but there's no way I'm putting my mouth on that. You can't unsee it. I'm being trivial, but I want to introduce you to someone in our history, our nation's history, who saw something he couldn't unsee. His name was Thomas Clarkson, and Rutger Bregman describes Clarkson's journey in his book, Moral Ambition. I want to read an excerpt from that book to you. In 1785, as a 24-year-old university student, Clarkson decided to enter an essay contest in Latin at the University of Cambridge, as you do. To take part, he had to answer a short question. This was the question: is it okay to force others into slavery? At the time, winning a Latin essay contest was the way to make a name for yourself at university. Clarkson says this. He says, I had no motive but that which other young men in the university had on such occasions, namely the wish of being distinguished, of obtaining literary honor. In other words, he had no motive to learn about the slave trade. He was simply wanting to advance in his academic career. There was just one small problem. Clarkson didn't know a thing about slavery. Students had 2 months to put their thoughts to paper, and while most only started to feel the pressure once the deadline was imminent, Clarkson was different. He got straight to work. The earnest student thought he would enjoy the research process, but the facts hit him hard. In the daytime, I was uneasy, Clarkson said. In the night, I had little rest. I sometimes never closed my eyelids for grief. A few weeks of hard work later, his essay was finished. In powerful prose, Clarkson concluded that slavery was, quote, contrary to reason, justice, nature, the principles of law and government, and the revealed voice of God. And you guessed it, he won first place. Clarkson was invited to present his winning essay in the majestic Senate House at the University of Cambridge. There he stood, a towering young man with fiery hair and bright eyes. All signs indicated Thomas Clarkson had a glorious career ahead of him. But on the way back to London, he couldn't get the subject of his essay out of his head. He got down from his horse and he walked, distracted. He tried to convince himself he'd made some mistake, that the grisly facts couldn't be right. But the longer he thought about it, the deeper the truth sunk in. When the little village of Wade's Mill came into view, he stopped and sat down, glum, at the side of the road. Here a thought came into my mind, he would later write, that if the contents of the essay were true, then it was time some person should see this calamities to their end. If the end of the global slave trade started anywhere, it started here, at the side of the road, outside Wade's Mill. Of course, there had been others who protested against the most heinous forms of slavery, and certainly history is filled with acts of resistance by enslaved people who time and again worked to throw off their chains. But the fact of the matter is that for centuries, victims of the system weren't able to overthrow that system. The very notion of abolitionism, the idea that the whole institution of slavery could be abolished once and for all, long seemed unthinkable. One evening, at a dinner with a few other abolitionists, Clarkson made a decision. The young man knew someone had to dedicate their life to the fight against slavery, so he stood up and announced to everyone there, I'm ready to devote myself to the cause. For the rest of his life, 61 years more, he continued to fight for his ideals. In 1787, Clarkson became one of the 12 founders of the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, 1787. After a years-long campaign, the UK officially banned the slave trade in 1807, at a time of peak profits, no less. The British then forced other countries out. The Royal Navy launched the, quote, blockade of Africa, where they captured 2,000 slaving vessels and freed those aboard. In the end, two experts estimate, direct British efforts accounted for eliminating 80% of the slave trade. From 1807 to 1867, the British put an astronomical amount of money into enforcing the ban, nearly 2% of the national income, which is 4 times our current foreign aid budget today. The researchers speak of that this was the, quote, the most costly international moral action in modern history. The historian Christopher Leslie Brown, one of the foremost experts on British abolitionism, was once asked who the most consequential individual was in the British anti-slavery movement. The more he realized, Brown realized that some individuals outsized others, Thomas Clarkson in particular. As far as the movement goes, Brown said, Clarkson is essential to what ends up emerging. Clarkson grew to be one of the greatest reformers of his time, what the Apostle Paul was to Christianity and Martin Luther to the Reformation, Clarkson was to abolitionism. They called him, quote, a moral steam engine. A contemporary called him a giant with one idea. What happened to Clarkson? He saw something he couldn't unsee. And it changed everything. And when we look back at this ragtag group of Near Easterners who 2,000 years ago, men and women, some of them teenagers, who turned the world upside down with a story about a man raising from the dead, they weren't doing that because they had an ideology that they wanted to enforce on everybody else. They weren't wanting to start a new religion. They weren't interested in overthrowing the Roman Empire within 300 years of that date. They weren't looking at founding the ideals that would eventually become democracy and Western civilization. They'd just seen something they couldn't unsee. They'd seen a man who, from a poor background and little to no education, started working wonders. People from surrounding towns would bring hundreds of sick people, lame people, deaf people, blind people. And with extraordinary power and compassion and grace, he would heal them all. They heard extraordinary words come from his mouth. Some of the words he spoke 2,000 years later, some of the greatest minds in human history have spent their entire lives and careers trying to figure out and learn. They heard from this man who then became a political and a religious threat to those who were in power. People in power who figured out they couldn't control him or contain him. They'd seen this man somehow, they couldn't understand, be given over to torture, be given over to public execution. But most extraordinary of all, they'd seen him rise from the dead. It was God's act of vindicating his entire life and his message, saying, everything this man has said, everything he's done, I put my stamp of approval on it. There's a few things we can't unsee from Easter weekend. To be honest, there is enough content inside of Easter weekend that if that's the only thing we had in the entire Bible, you and I could spend the next 10 lifetimes trying to understand it and grasp it. That's the size of the implications. One of the things we learn is the brutality of life. I just thought I'd start on a chipper note. The brutality of life. If you've lived longer than a few years, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I talked to a dear person in my life last week who a couple years ago, after a multi-year battle with cancer, was declared cancer-free. It was a beautiful, beautiful moment. But about a year ago, one of their children started dealing again with mental health issues. When I spoke to them last week, their child was in a mental health hospital, and they had just found out they'd been re-diagnosed with cancer. And in my heart, I felt this. Life is brutal. But if anything, Easter weekend teaches us God knows that too. You see, Jesus became the place, the person where the true face of our sin and our brokenness is revealed. Our sin is revealed in all its rage, its jealousy, exploitation, its self-centeredness, and its remorselessness. His body was the canvas that God painted the revelation of our sin on, our brokenness, our lust, our abuse, our indifference to suffering, our self-loathing and insecurities, our passion for power. Friday was God's picture of what sin looks like fully realized. The cross recognizes the brutal life you and I live, but more importantly, it reveals God's orientation. It reveals his character towards our sin. We can't always know why pain and suffering hit us, but we can know why they don't hit us. It can't be because God didn't love us. Because when things were at their worst, he chose to get involved. Billy Graham famously said it wasn't nails that held Jesus to the cross, it was love. At the snap of his fingers, he could have called all the hosts of heaven to bring him down, bring himself down, but he didn't. So if he had the power to remove himself, why didn't he? Because he was not simply the picture of what our sin is, he was also the picture of what God's love looks like in action. It joins our stories. He does not stay distant. He does not stay distant, just sending us well wishes, good thoughts, humble teachings. Jesus is the only religious leader in history not to tell us the way to get to God, but to be the way to get to God. It's not just his teachings that are meaningful. It is him. It is his life. It is his commitment to stay in the suffering, to stay in the pain, to allow my sin to keep him there. We don't know why suffering exists, but it can't be because God doesn't love us. How do I know? The cross. The only thing God hadn't known before the cross was suffering. But now the writer of Hebrews tells us he has been in all ways touched with the feelings of our infirmities, our suffering, our pain. Sure, he knew it intellectually, but now he knows it. The cross also qualifies your hatred of injustice. You see, without the cross, you can say you wished things weren't this way, but you could never say things shouldn't be this way. That's two different things. How do you know things shouldn't be this way? Is that just your personal preference? Because other people, abusers, dictators, they want things to be this way. So whose way is right? The only way you can say things shouldn't be this way, if someone from a higher perspective, perhaps the source of all goodness and light, he validates that perspective, that longing for justice by joining in and recognizing, no, I'm joining your suffering too. Not only that, I'm going to defeat it. Things shouldn't be this way. The only way you can have a deep down in your bones conviction that things should be better than they are is if you can point to a God who agrees with you, who is singing the same song, who their view of right and wrong outlives you, and it started before you existed, and it would exist if you and I were never here. Who's to say you're right and the abuser is wrong? Who's to say you're right and cancer is wrong? Who's to say you're right and poverty is wrong? Unless God shows us, we can't know it. But when he does, our demand for justice is given wings. Until then, you're just sitting on the runway. The cross qualifies your hatred of sin and your demand for justice. It shows us life is brutal, but it also shows us a God who joins us there. Easter weekend also shows us an action plan. I know I'm moving forward about 100 steps there. It shows us an action plan. Because it reveals how sin is not simply one bad act, but it's the perpetuating of brokenness one person to another. And the only thing that could stop this perpetuation is the perfect man, the perfect human, who became the one who adopted all of our brokenness and then defeated it. And our life becomes his life. His life becomes our life. So he did not simply die to wash away your guilt. He did not simply die so that our records are clean. It was not simply about dealing with sin. The cross was also about dealing with the sinner. It was not simply my record is gone. I was on that cross, Paul says. I was joined with Christ. And I'm now able to be rescued from the story where I'm perpetuating the brokenness that had been done to me. That's the story of human history. It starts in Genesis chapter 3, where people disobey God, and then the next chapter they're trying to murder each other because they're jealous, and then on and on and on. They're building a tower, and then it just continues. And what is it? It is something breaks in us, so we start to live out of that brokenness, and we start to break others. And we become perpetuators of the brokenness that we received. But at the cross, there's a different story that started. We have an action plan, and the action plan is this. You can receive forgiveness that is so profound that you recognize, I have been washed clean by the only one who can wash me clean. So now I don't have to be a perpetuator of brokenness. I can be an ambassador of peace. I can now give the forgiveness that I at one time received. You now have an action plan. The next thing, there's so many, we could study this forever, that we find in Easter weekend is a hope. But it's a hope that has substance. Without the resurrection, even if we have the cross, we can have hope, but it's not a hope with substance. The resurrection means we can have a hope with substance, and that our hope is not simply a consolation prize. Well done, you survived life. You didn't win, but here's a prize for participating. Have you ever received a consolation prize? One year growing up playing football, I always played on one of two teams, depending on our age group. And one year I would play with a group of guys who were 1 year older than me. And so I was always the worst person on the team. They were always better because at that age, 1 year, you're physically transformed from where you were the year before. So we always won everything. And then the next year, I'm the one old one, and everybody else on the team is younger. And so that year, one of those years, I'm the oldest person on the team, so I know we're going to do horrendous. But I'm like, maybe I can do well. I can shine as the star of this team. So we show up at our first friendly match, which was against the team that I had played for the year before. So a lot bigger guys. And at the start of the whistle, I collide with one of the strikers, and he kicks my leg, and my leg breaks. The femur bone all the way through. So I spend the entire season, I don't play a match at all in that season. I spend the entire season out, and at the end of the whole season, they give the whole team, the team did horrendous, they did terrible. They gave everybody on the team a trophy. I got a trophy that year. Does that annoy anybody else? Well done, you broke your leg. We were the worst team in the league. Here's a trophy. How much do you think that trophy meant to me? I'm saying, it's a consolation. We just want to just motivate you as young men to do well in life. Here's a trophy for having a broken leg. This is the part of the story that we see on Emmaus Road. Okay, so they're walking. The guys are walking. They just experienced the worst weekend of their life, and they're talking about the wrestling, and they're saying there's amazing things that just happened, but we hoped that he was the Redeemer of Israel. And now we're just not really sure where to put all of the last 3 years of our life. Has anybody ever felt like that with God? I just hope, I'd hoped that this would pan out different. I'd hoped that I wouldn't be this old and still be single. I'd hoped that I wouldn't have a child that went wayward. I hope that I by now knew what I was going to do in my career. I had hoped that I wouldn't have failed that university course. I don't really know how to connect the dots. But when Jesus was raised from the dead, Your hope now has substance. Because death isn't the end. Let me say it like this. The worst that can happen isn't the end of the story. Jesus allowed sin and pain and brokenness to take him to the end. He paid the ultimate price, and it wasn't the end. Jesus' resurrection vindicates and validates every hope-filled person. Lev Grossman, a science fiction and fantasy writer, he wrote a short story called The Map of Tiny Perfect Things. It's now been turned into a film by Amazon. But in it, the protagonist, Mark, he finds himself in a looping day. You ever seen Groundhog Day? It's that vibe, except it's like teenage rom-com combined with, I'm really selling this, aren't I? So anyway, the map of tiny perfect things. And so Mark wakes up every day in the same day. That's the loop he's in. And he's trying to figure out how to get out of this loop. So he's trying to figure what's the clues? What are the clues I have to do today to stop this looping day? And one day he noticed an anomaly. So he memorizes every day because every day is the same. And the anomaly was another person, and it was Margaret. So he meets Margaret, and he finally is able to have a conversation with Margaret and find out she is also in the looping day, and she realizes what's happening. So they together then start trying to figure out, how do we break this looping day? So after working day after day, trying to break the loop, and they're using everything from physics to international travel to finding all the meaningful moments, simple, everyday meaningful moments throughout the day. Mark seems to give up. And him and Margaret kind of part ways. But then one day, he accidentally stumbles upon Margaret's mother in the hospital. And Margaret's mother is terminally ill, and she passes every evening in this looping day. When Mark realizes this, he says to himself, all along, I thought this was my story. But this story isn't about me. This is Margaret's story. This changes everything. It wasn't Mark's ability to sort the physics of the puzzle in the time loop to break out of the meaninglessness and struggle of endless monotony. It was realizing that everything hinged on Margaret's ability to get beyond death. And when Mark joined Margaret's story, he realized his reason for being. Margaret's personal victory over death was everyone else's too. This is the story of all creation. This is the story you and I live in. We can seek to sort our problems by becoming greater than them, mastering the physics behind the world we're in, wielding weapons of technology or wealth or power. But the global pandemic, to climate change, to natural disasters, we are regularly reminded that our power isn't enough. Can I get a witness? Or we can come to terms with our struggle by finding meaning and wonder in everyday, ordinary things. The optimism of spring, maybe a little suntan. It comes after winter, new life after death. This is another thing Jesus was trying to deal with in Luke 24 when he's saying, this is not a metaphorical resurrection. Give me something to eat. Look, touch me. This is an actual concrete event in history. This is not just think good thoughts after bad things. And although this idea would be heartwarming, we know that that kind of optimism is merely a consolation at best. At worst, it's a delusion. The only thing sufficient enough to bear our suffering and validate our hopes is if this story isn't about us. It's about a God who saw the suffering of humanity, who chose to be unified with our suffering. It brings pain and suffering into a depth of meaning that we couldn't comprehend without his involvement. Only then, only when we can see this story is actually Jesus' story. Only then do we find rescue. If the story shows that our love, our hopes, our pleasures, our fulfilled longings are not simply chemical reactions in our biology, but they are real. They point towards something even more real. The love story between Creator God and his creation is not just comforting us from death, it is using death. He simultaneously submitted to it and conquered it. He wielded it to move all of us into ceaseless life, perfect love, and boundless flourishing. That's the story. That's the story. When you recognize and find your life hidden in him, hidden in Christ, that as you, he died, as you, he was buried, and as you, he was raised again. You don't have to live in death. You don't have to live in burial. You don't have to live without resurrection. Today, you and I have access to get out of the meaningless, mundane loop of life and find real life in him and him alone.